Welcome, everyone. Today, we're looking at a holiday that seems so familiar, but its origins are far more complicated and contested than most of us realize. Thanksgiving.
That's right.
You probably think you know the story, the pilgrims, the turkey, all of that, but we're going to show you that the real history is this tangled web of religious revolution, political maneuvering, and even global migration.
It's one of those holidays that feels uniquely American or maybe Canadian, but when you actually dig into the historical record, its roots stretch back across continents and centuries.
Right.
What we call Thanksgiving today is really a historical mashup. It's been heavily influenced by economics and politics, which ended up determining not just what we celebrate, but crucially, when.
And our goal today is to go beyond those North American stories and uncover the diverse religious origins, the political forces that shape the dates, and its, frankly, surprising presence around the world. We want to find out why the date has shifted so many times, why Canada celebrates it weeks earlier than the U.S., and why it means something completely different in a place like Grenada.
Exactly. Broadly, Thanksgiving is a national holiday for giving thanks, usually tied to the harvest or the blessings of the past year. And while it definitely has historical roots in religious traditions, particularly Protestantism, for a long time now it's been celebrated as a secular holiday across the globe.
And that global map of Thanksgiving is just startlingly complex. When you mention the holiday, I think most people's minds go straight to the U.S. date in late November. But you find official, or at least similar, observances in a whole range of places.
Oh, absolutely. We see official national recognition in the United States, Canada, the Caribbean nation of St. Lucia, and even the West African nation of Liberia.
Liberia, now.
And beyond that, you have similar harvest celebrations like the Erntedankfest in Germany or this unique observance on Australia's Norfolk Island. It just shows that this impulse for gratitude is universal, even if the timing and the history are wildly different.
So to really understand the North American holiday, we can't start with a feast. We have to start with a period of intense religious upheaval in England.
That's the key. I mean, special ceremonies of thanks after a harvest, those are common across most religions. But the specific legal and theological structure of the holiday as we know it, that comes directly out of the English Reformation.
That's a crucial distinction.
It is. The specific legal context dates from the Protestant Reformation in the mid-1500s. Before the reforms under Henry VIII, the Catholic Church mandated 95 fixed church holidays. 95 plus every Sunday. And on those days, people were required to attend church and, importantly, not work.
That is an incredible number of days off. I mean, that's nearly a third of the year as non-working time mandated by the church.
Precisely. And you can imagine the economic pressure that created. So when Henry VIII's reforms kicked in after 1536, the new Church of England slashed those holidays down to just 27.
And part of that was theological, rejecting the Pope, but it sounds like a huge part of it was just economics.
It was. It was about getting people back to work and generating wealth. But the people we associate with the North American holiday, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, they wanted to go even further.
They wanted to abolish the fixed holidays entirely.
They did. The Puritan party inside the Anglican Church had this deep theological objection to all fixed church-mandated holidays. That included Christmas and Easter. They saw them as remnants of Catholicism, what they called papal tradition. Their doctrine argued that if the Bible didn't explicitly command a yearly celebration, it shouldn't exist. For them, the only mandated holy day was the weekly Lord's Day, which is Sunday.
So if you get rid of all the annual holidays, what system did the Puritans create for showing thanks?
They instituted these specially called ad hoc days of fasting and days of thanksgiving. They were seen as direct, spontaneous responses to God's immediate actions.
So not a fixed date on a calendar.
No, the idea was that worship should be a genuine, timely reaction, not just something you repeat mechanically every year.
So if there was a terrible drought or a plague or some kind of military threat, they would call a day of fasting.
Correct. A day of fasting or humiliation was for unexpected disasters. And on the flip side, days of Thanksgiving were called for special, immediate blessings, which they saw as signs of God's favor.
And this tradition became formalized in England first, right, long before they were establishing major colonies in North America.
Absolutely. We have very specific examples. A day of Thanksgiving was called after the unexpected victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588. Another one followed the deliverance of Queen Anne in 1605. These were national political events, not agricultural ones.
And the most enduring example from England is Guy Fawkes Day, which actually started as a political Thanksgiving.
It did. The failure of the gunpowder plot in 1605, that was Guy Fawkes's attempt to blow up Parliament, it was seen as such a huge deliverance that an annual day of Thanksgiving was mandated by law starting in 1606, and that observance evolved into what we now know as Guy Fawkes Day.
So the holiday's earliest function was often tied to political or military survival. That's a far cry from a shared harvest meal.
A very far cry.
Okay, so let's connect that very specific Puritan political custom to the colonies. The earliest documented annual tradition in North America actually takes us south to Virginia, not New England.
This is a really crucial piece of forgotten history. 2 years before that famous Plymouth feast, 38 English settlers on a ship called the Margaret arrived at Berkeley Hundred in Virginia. The date was December 4th, 1619.
And what made this arrival so distinct?
It was the nature of their charter. Their charter from the London Company was a legally binding document, and it specifically dictated that the day of their safe arrival, December 4th, shall be yearly and perpetually kept holy as a day of thanksgiving to Almighty God.
So this wasn't a spontaneous feast after a good harvest.
Not at all. It was a mandated, perpetual religious and legal holiday. It was an immediate act of corporate political thanksgiving for their safe journey.
So the Virginia claim is rooted in this legal decree, in perpetuity, which makes it a very powerful contender for the origin of the annual holiday tradition in the U.S.
Exactly. It had a legal weight that the 1621 Plymouth Feast, which was a one-time event, simply did not. And that original celebration, defined by that 1619 charter, it's still commemorated annually today at Berkeley Plantation. It really highlights the longevity of this claim.
Okay, but despite that very strong legal mandate behind the Virginia claim, the national narrative has been almost entirely dominated by the New England story. So let's unpack that familiar Plymouth narrative from 1621.
The 1621 Plymouth event with the Pilgrims was a multi-day communal festival. It was prompted by a surprisingly good harvest after a really terrible first year. But, and this is important, if you look at the primary historical accounts like Edward Winslow's letter, it was not described as a Thanksgiving at the time.
And why is that label so important? You mentioned the Puritan theological structure earlier.
It's important because the Puritans and the Pilgrims had a very strict definition of a day of Thanksgiving. Those days involved specific worship services, often solemn fasting, religious reflection. They were usually held midweek.
And a multi-day feast with games didn't fit that.
Not at all. A multi-day event with feasting, drinking, and sporting contests, which is what the 1621 event was, just did not fit their definition. They called it a rejoicing, not a Thanksgiving.
This event is also often, romanticized, and that ignores the intense geopolitical context of the Indigenous participation.
We have to emphasize this context. The Wampanoag people, led by Massasoit, they didn't just show up to share food in a moment of spontaneous friendship. They had a complex mutual defense treaty with the colonists, and it was brokered out of necessity for both groups.
Right.
The Wampanoag had previously provided food to the colonists when they were starving, and in exchange, they got an alliance and protection against their powerful rival, the Narragansett tribe.
And the story is that the Wampanoag contingent arrived because of noise.
Yes. The colonists were firing ceremonial gunfire to celebrate the harvest, and the Wampanoag, responding in alarm, thought the colonists were under attack. When Massasoit realized it was a peaceful celebration, he and his men then contributed resources for the event.
So it's fundamentally a diplomatic and military affirmation of an existing treaty.
It was a geopolitical meeting as much as it was a feast.
So this significant event was then forgotten for centuries, but later inserted as the founding myth. How does a forgotten feast become the central national narrative?
This is just a stunning example of historical revisionism, and it was driven by regional politics. The 1621 event was largely absent from the American consciousness until the mid-19th century. It was retroactively termed the first Thanksgiving in a single footnote.
A single footnote?
A single footnote in an 1841 text by a writer named Alexander Young.
Wow, a footnote redefined a national tradition. That's incredible.
And it gave fuel to the sort of regional boosterism. The main push to solidify the narrative came from the Old Colony Club, a group of prominent citizens from Plymouth. They were fiercely protective of Plymouth's place in the nation's founding story.
And they were worried Plymouth was being overshadowed.
They were. They feared Plymouth was being overshadowed by the rising importance of Revolutionary War sites and the growing historical weight of Virginia, especially with its well-documented 1619 charter.
So they successfully leveraged this footnote to create an origin myth tied to New England.
They did, and their efforts happened to coincide with this national movement led by Sarah Josepha Hale, who was pushing for a fixed national Thanksgiving date. By emphasizing the Pilgrim story, they provided this moral, religiously resonant, and geographically convenient New England origin for a nation that was grappling with its identity right before the Civil War.
So stepping outside of the Pilgrim versus Virginia debate, I know historians talk about the marvelous nonsense of competing claims for the first service in what became the U.S. It gets even more complicated.
It becomes almost impossible to define first. I mean, if we define Thanksgiving as the earliest documented religious service for gratitude on this land, historians point to September 8, 1565.
1565.
56 years before Plymouth. This was when the Spanish community in St. Augustine, Florida, celebrated a religious service when they arrived safely. They held a mass and shared a communal meal.
And the Spanish influence extends to the Southwest as well.
It does. Claims also exist for an earlier religious service by Spanish explorers at San Elizario, Texas in 1598. But, like the Florida claim, neither of these led to the establishment of an annual recurring national tradition that defines the modern holiday.
We could even trace the Pilgrims' own celebrations back to Europe.
That's right. The Pilgrims lived in Leiden, in the Netherlands, for over a decade. They were undoubtedly influenced by the local autumn celebration there, the Three Oktoberfeest. And historical accounts suggest that sectarian disturbances in Leiden in 1617 actually accelerated their plans to emigrate. So even their motivation to leave Europe was tied to these established days of civic and religious reflection.
So with so many legitimate, complicated claims, how did the U.S. government ultimately navigate this historical confusion?
Well, in 1963, President John F. Kennedy issued Proclamation 3560. He performed this really neat political compromise, just beautifully sidestepping the whole argument.
What did he do?
He acknowledged both the Virginia and the Massachusetts claims explicitly in the proclamation. He gave thanks for safety, health, fertility, and faith. This move allowed the government to embrace both foundational narratives, providing a politically unifying message instead of declaring one side the winner.
So once the concept of a National Day of Thanks existed, it still wasn't fixed on a specific date for nearly a century?
No, not at all. From the Founding Fathers up until the Civil War, the date varied widely by state.
And its political nature was there from the very beginning of the country.
Immediately, George Washington proclaimed the first nationwide celebration on November 26, 1789. He called it a day of public thanksgiving and prayer, and he specifically asked Americans to implore the interposition of the Almighty Hand to heal the wounds of the nation.
So it was immediately tied to national unity and post-war healing.
Exactly. But those early federal proclamations were one-offs. The holiday didn't become an annual national standard until President Lincoln.
And that push was really driven by one person, wasn't it?
It was. Largely by the persistent efforts of an activist named Sarah Josepha Hale. She was the editor of a hugely influential women's magazine, and she spent about 40 years writing letters to politicians, governors, and presidents, advocating for a permanent, fixed date.
That sustained effort finally paid off during the Civil War.
Indeed. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln formalized the national celebration, and he set the date for the final Thursday in November. Lincoln saw the holiday as a crucial tool for national morale during the war.
And in setting that final Thursday, he phased out a pre-existing holiday.
It was a very pragmatic decision. Evacuation Day, which commemorated the British military leaving New York City after the Revolutionary War, was celebrated on November 25th. By setting Thanksgiving on the final Thursday, it essentially overshadowed and eventually superseded this older patriotic observance.
A truly nationwide celebration, though, was delayed by the war itself.
It was. While Lincoln proclaimed it nationally, the South obviously did not observe a Union holiday during the conflict. Thanksgiving wasn't universally celebrated across all states until the Reconstruction era, around the 1870s.
And this seemingly stable date led directly to the famous Thanksgiving crisis. This is one of the most fascinating examples of political intervention in the calendar.
The Thanksgiving episode of 1939 to 41 was a massive political miscalculation by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. On October 31st, 1939, he signed a proclamation changing the date from the final Thursday to the next to last Thursday in November.
And what was the singular reason for moving this deeply established tradition?
It was almost entirely economic. Specifically, it was about the Great Depression. Retailers didn't promote Christmas sales until after Thanksgiving. And in years where November had 5 Thursdays, the holiday fell late, which created a very short Christmas shopping window.
So moving it gave people an extra week to shop.
It created an extra 7 days for consumer activity, which Roosevelt hoped would boost the struggling economy.
That sounds reasonable in theory, but the timing of the announcement was a disaster.
It was. Making the announcement so late, only 3 weeks before the scheduled date, caused immediate and severe chaos. School schedules had to be changed. Colleges planning their big Thanksgiving football games had tickets printed and opponents scheduled for the traditional date.
So the economic benefit came at the expense of massive logistical confusion.
Absolutely. The proclamation was widely unpopular, and the public, particularly Republicans who opposed Roosevelt, quickly dubbed the new date Franksgiving.
Franksgiving.
And this political split created the bewildering situation of having dual holidays observed across the country for 2 years.
It did. It was a genuine constitutional crisis of calendar coordination. State governors had to choose. Wow. Some followed Roosevelt's new date. Others, resisting federal pressure, stuck with the original final Thursday.
So different states celebrated on different days.
At one point, 22 states observed the new Franksgiving date, 23 observed the traditional date, and 3 states, Colorado, Mississippi, and Texas, decided to observe both dates. They gave their citizens 2 Thanksgivings for 2 straight years. That must have been incredibly confusing for families and businesses.
It was a logistical and social nightmare. Families were often split depending on which state they lived in. It became a highly visible political football.
So how was this finally untangled?
The dual Thanksgiving continued for 2 years. Recognizing the damage, Congress finally stepped in. On December 26, 1941, just weeks after the U.S. entered World War II, a joint resolution was passed. Roosevelt signed it, and it officially and permanently fixed the National Thanksgiving Day to the 4th Thursday in November.
And that's the date we've had ever since.
It has remained fixed since 1942, settling that political battle.
Okay, moving north, Canadian Thanksgiving is officially on the second Monday in October, with a completely distinct origin story. And the key difference in timing is just geographical, right?
Precisely. The date is settled earlier than the U.S. date because of geography. Canada's harvest season just concludes sooner because of the earlier onset of winter.
What are the main historical roots for the Canadian celebration?
There are several. One thread goes back to the French settlers in New France in the 17th century, who celebrated harvests with feasts, often sharing with Indigenous peoples. Another involves New England settlers who moved north to Nova Scotia after 1700 and brought their own autumn celebrations with them.
But there's a much earlier and very controversial claim associated with an explorer.
That is the Frobisher claim of 1578. Some historians assert that the very first Thanksgiving in North America occurred during the voyage of the English explorer Martin Frobisher while he was searching for the Northwest Passage.
But this wasn't a harvest celebration.
Not at all. It was a formal religious service giving thanks for their successful passage across the Atlantic, which had been extremely dangerous. It fits that classic English model of a political day of thanksgiving for deliverance. But many researchers find no compelling narrative that this isolated event directly evolved into the modern Canadian holiday.
So, if the earliest Canadian origins were disconnected from the U.S., how did things like turkey and other traditions get incorporated?
That happened much later, during and after the American Revolution. The United Empire Loyalists, those who stayed loyal to the British Crown, fled the U.S. and settled in Canada, and they brought with them the New England harvest feast traditions.
And when did Canada finally try to fix a national date?
Before Confederation, the date was sporadic. The first official National Canadian Thanksgiving was on April 15, 1872, and that date was chosen specifically to celebrate the recovery of the Prince of Wales from a serious illness.
So again, it's political and dynastic deliverance, not agriculture, driving the earliest national observances.
Exactly. And throughout the late 19th century, the date was still unstable, usually celebrated around November 6th. But an interesting historical force began pushing the date earlier: the Canadian militia.
The militia? How did they influence the holiday calendar?
The militia staged these large-scale sham battles for public entertainment on Thanksgiving Day. They started to agitate for an earlier date in October to take advantage of warmer weather.
Warmer weather meant bigger crowds.
Bigger crowds, more success for their public spectacle. So the desire for better military showmanship was a definite factor in moving the holiday out of November.
That is a detail I would never have guessed. So what finally secured the second Monday in October?
The final fixation in 1957 was driven by a need to avoid clashing with a much more somber national holiday. The Canadian Parliament proclaimed Thanksgiving to be on the second Monday in October, primarily to prevent it from conflicting with Armistice Day, now Remembrance Day, on November 11th.
So it seems both the U.S. and Canada had to reconcile Thanksgiving with prior patriotic holidays to fix their dates.
That's absolutely the unifying theme. Both nations realized that for the holiday to function effectively on the calendar, it had to be strategically placed.
And is it uniformly recognized across all provinces today?
It is a statutory holiday in all provinces and territories, except for New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. In those two provinces, while it's still widely celebrated, it's not legally mandated as a statutory paid day off for all workers.
What's truly fascinating is tracking this 17th century Puritan idea as it crossed oceans. Let's start our global journey in West Africa with Liberia.
Liberia observes Thanksgiving on the first Thursday in November. The origin here is a direct cultural transplant. The holiday was brought by former slaves and free people of color who founded the nation in 1821 as a colony of the American Colonization Society.
Do the modern Liberian celebrations mirror the American ones?
They're quite distinct. While families might have a feast, there's no specific national staple food like the U.S. turkey. Celebrations usually begin with religious ceremonies in churches. For many, the rest of the day is a time for relaxation and quiet appreciation.
Does the holiday carry any political tension, given its origins in American colonization?
It does. Historically, some Liberians have viewed it as an imposition from the Americo-Liberian settlers. But in the 21st century, particularly after the devastating Second Civil War, many have embraced the holiday for its literal purpose, using it as a time to be genuinely thankful for the current period of peace and stability.
So its meaning has been updated for their modern political reality.
Yes, it has.
Moving to South America, Brazil adopted Thanksgiving relatively late, but fixed it to the U.S. date.
Brazil's National Thanksgiving Day takes place on the fourth Thursday in November. It was introduced in 1949 by President Eurico Gaspar Dutra. The inspiration came from an ambassador, Joaquim Nabuco, who had served in Washington, D.C., and was deeply impressed by the U.S. commemorations he saw there.
So a diplomatic observation led to its adoption.
Exactly. The date was officially fixed in 1966. And while it's not as universally celebrated as Carnival or Christmas, it has a strong following, particularly with families of American origin and various Protestant Christian denominations.
Which again highlights that enduring Protestant root, even when transplanted to a largely Catholic country.
That's right.
Shifting back to Europe, Germany has a strong harvest tradition that exists sort of unofficially alongside the American custom.
Germany celebrates the Erntegenfest, or Harvest Thanksgiving Festival, on the first Sunday of October. And unlike the U.S. Thanksgiving, which has become largely secular, the Erntedankfest retains a very strong central religious component.
What are the key elements of that celebration?
Churches are elaborately decorated with autumn crops, sheaves of grain, fruit, vegetables. There are special church services, and in many regions, traditional processions or parades. The focus is squarely on the communal and spiritual recognition of the agricultural year.
And the Netherlands, which housed the pilgrims, has a dual observance.
The connection to the pilgrims is fascinating. To commemorate the hospitality they received in Leiden, a non-denominational Thanksgiving Day service is held annually at the Pieterskirk Church there, on the morning of the American Thanksgiving Day.
So it's a historical nod to the U.S. origin story.
Exactly. But the more traditional Orthodox Protestant churches observe Dankdag, or Day of Thanks, on the first Wednesday in November. It's not a public holiday, but those who observe it attend solemn church services. It's a much more reserved, spiritual affair.
And the holiday even managed to reach the remote South Pacific, carried by sailors.
That brings us to Norfolk Island, an Australian external territory. They celebrate Thanksgiving on the last Wednesday of November. This unusual date traces back to the island being a major hub for American whaling ships in the mid-19th century. The whalers just introduced their observance far from home.
It's essentially the Wednesday before the U.S. celebration.
That's right. It's a remarkable piece of cultural history dictated by maritime trade.
Now, we saw political manipulation in the U.S. with Thanksgiving. That phenomenon was even more starkly pronounced in the Philippines, where the holiday was used to legitimize martial law.
The Philippines observed Thanksgiving on the U.S. date during its time as an American colony. But after 1969, President Ferdinand Marcos drastically changed its meaning.
What was his motivation?
In 1973, Marcos issued a proclamation changing the holiday's observance to September 21st. This was a nakedly political move. September 21st was the one-year anniversary of his imposition of martial law. He was literally altering a historical holiday to commemorate and legitimize his authoritarian takeover.
And this practice was sustained.
It was, until Marcos was ousted in 1986. Since then, Thanksgiving has not been a public holiday in the Philippines. It's a potent historical reminder of how authoritarian power can co-opt and redefine historical observances for its own self-interest.
Finally, let's return to the UK. They have their own deep-seated harvest traditions, but the American version is growing in popularity.
The traditional British Harvest Festival of Thanksgiving is ancient. It typically happens in late September or early October and has roots stretching back to pre-Christian times.
What does the modern British Harvest Festival look like?
It's predominantly a community and school event, not a national day off. It involves singing, praying, and decorating churches. A central component is gathering food collections, which are then distributed to local charities and food banks. The focus is much more on community giving than on family feasting.
But the American model is gaining traction.
Yes. The celebration of American Thanksgiving, with turkey and the late November timing, has grown significantly in the UK in the 2020s. It's driven by the large population of American expatriates, the appeal of the cuisine, and its depiction in U.S. media.
To emphasize just how far the term Thanksgiving Day has drifted from its original roots, we have to highlight two holidays that share the name but commemorate profoundly different events.
The most dramatic example is the Caribbean island of Grenada, which celebrates Thanksgiving Day on October 25th. The date is near the Canadian holiday, but its purpose is completely and soberly unrelated to any harvest celebration.
This marks the anniversary of the 1983 U.S.-led invasion.
It does. The holiday marks the anniversary of the intervention by the United States and other Caribbean forces. This happened in response to an internal political crisis in 1983, which saw the deposition and execution of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop by a military government.
That is a sensitive and complex historical marker for the region.
Absolutely. The intervention was framed as a mission to restore democracy, but it remains a divisive event. For Grenadians, the day is a national holiday, recognizing a moment of intense political tension and military intervention. And it's vital to approach this with sympathy for those affected, recognizing that for them, this holiday marks a painful and distinct political event.
It's the ultimate example of a holiday name being co-opted to mark a political turning point, not an agricultural one.
It really highlights the complex relationship between the U.S. and the Caribbean.
Meanwhile, in Japan, the holiday is based on ancient roots, but was formalized by a very modern, labor-focused political structure.
Japan celebrates Labor Thanksgiving Day, or Kinryu Kansha no Hai, on November 23. The modern holiday was established during the American occupation after World War II. It's legally cited as an occasion for commemorating labor and production and giving thanks to each other for the year's work.
So it's a holiday of modern gratitude for an industrial society.
Precisely. However, it's fundamentally based on the much older, ancient Shinto harvest ceremony known as Ninamsi. The U.S. occupation reinterpreted this tradition, stripping away the imperial elements and transforming it into a secular celebration of the worker for a post-war context. The ancient harvest root is there, but the modern veneer is entirely focused on labor.
So returning one last time to the U.S., the fixed date of the fourth Thursday in November really secured Thanksgiving's crucial place as the undisputed opener of the American holiday season.
This is its modern cultural function. Thanksgiving acts as the starting pistol for this massive wave of holidays and social gatherings that dominate the final weeks of the year.
And its timing defines the commercial calendar, particularly with Black Friday, cementing that move from solemn reflection to consumerism.
The very next day, Black Friday, marks the official feverish beginning of the Christmas shopping season, and that commercial anchor is then followed by Cyber Monday and Giving Tuesday. The original Puritan intent of pious reflection has really been subsumed by commercial pressures.
Beyond shopping, the observation involves highly recognizable cultural practices: family, food, and these high-profile public events.
Traditional Thanksgiving Day is characterized by a massive family meal: turkey, stuffing, cranberries. Culturally, it's also heavily intertwined with sporting events, especially professional football. The NFL games on Thanksgiving are a staple for millions.
And we've also seen a new, specific cultural shift emerge over the last decade regarding who people celebrate with.
That is the emergence of Friendsgiving. Starting around the 2010s, this new tradition involves celebrating Thanksgiving specifically with a chosen circle of friends, either instead of or in addition to one's family. It really speaks to the growing need in modern society for these chosen family gatherings and shared celebrations that are less encumbered by traditional family dynamics.
And finally, the massive public celebrations define the holiday's spectacle and commercial power.
We have to highlight the major public parades. The Macy's Thanksgiving Parade in New York is the most famous, but similar massive parades are held in Philadelphia, Chicago, and even Plymouth, Massachusetts, where they blend the historical narrative with modern spectacle.
Those huge public events, dominated by corporate sponsors and pop stars, they really show the evolutionary distance the holiday has traveled from those initial Puritan days of reflection.
It's a complete transformation, from a spontaneous spiritual moment to a fixed, economically essential national institution.
So if we summarize our journey into the origins of Thanksgiving, the most compelling insights really come down to two things: how profoundly contested the history is, and how political manipulation was the key force in fixing its place on the calendar.
We've seen the holiday move from Puritan ministers eliminating Christmas to create these special ad hoc days of Thanksgiving, all the way through the calendar confusion of Thanksgiving when a president tried to use the holiday to solve a recession.
And we also traced its unique political roots in places like Grenada, where the name refers to a military intervention, not a harvest.
Our sources make it clear that the history of Thanksgiving is less about finding a single first event, whether that's the legal charter in Virginia or the diplomatic feast in Massachusetts, and far more about identifying which historical narrative was politically or culturally useful in shaping a national identity.
Right, and securing a specific date against competing national events.
Whether it was Lincoln using the concept of national bounty to call for healing, or the Canadian Parliament strategically moving the date to avoid conflict with Armistice Day, the dates and meanings we associate with Thanksgiving are less divine ordinance and more a result of historical consensus, driven by very human, political, and economic motivations.
So as you prepare for your next Thanksgiving, consider this. Modern secular celebrations, like the massive national parades, the corporate retail bonanza, Black Friday, and the emergence of Friendsgiving, have evolved that initial Puritan religious day of reflection into an institution that now primarily marks the kickoff of consumer culture and extended family time. It's a holiday defined by adaptation, necessity, and competing narratives for the right to define its meaning.
An interesting historical evolution indeed.
Thanks for listening.